Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, get straight to the insights you need. Global finance, tax laws, they're always moving, aren't they?
Constantly.
Especially if you're managing significant wealth across borders. It's a tricky landscape.
It demands real vigilance.
So today, we're tackling a big one. How do high net worth individuals, how do you navigate these waters when your home country just changes the rules dramatically?
And we're going to zoom in on a really fascinating case study for that, Brazil.
Yeah.
Specifically, their big 2023 tax reforms, Law 14.754 and also MP 1.171.
Right.
And these aren't small tweaks. I mean, they have fundamentally reshaped how offshore structures, how wealth management works for Brazilian residents.
Okay.
Our goal here really is to give you a solid foundation, a comprehensive understanding, sort of a shortcut to being well-informed, even if you've never really looked closely at Brazil's legal or tax system before.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission, cut through the complexity, explain what exactly changed, and maybe most importantly, why it matters. Why it matters to anyone dealing with international wealth. So first, let's set the scene a bit. Brazil. It has a large population of high net worth individuals.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Significant.
And many of them have diversified assets internationally for a long time. It's not new.
No, not at all. It's been a core strategy for decades. And there's a really important historical reason why. Before these reforms, Brazilian tax law, well, it let you defer taxes on income earned abroad.
Deferral, okay.
Yeah. Basically, you didn't owe tax until that money, that foreign income, was actually repatriated, brought back into Brazil.
So like money in an overseas piggy bank? Only taxed when you broke it open back home.
That's a good way to put it. This cash basis system, as it was called, it made offshore structures just incredibly attractive for tax planning. You could delay paying tax on reinvested profits for, well, potentially a very long time.
And these offshore structures, we're talking about the usual suspects, the legal tools people use.
Exactly. Things like private investment companies, PICs, you hear them called.
Right.
Offshore funds, various kinds of trusts. These were the go-to options. And it's worth remembering the tax authority there, the Receita Federal do Brasil, the RFB, they oversee all this. And Brazil is plugged into global transparency stuff like CRS, the Common Reporting Standard.
Got it. So transparency efforts were already happening. But the core appeal was that tax deferral.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's get into the toolbox itself. You mentioned PICs, funds, trusts. How exactly were high net worth Brazilians using these tools before everything changed? This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Let's break them down. First up, the private investment company, the PIC. Think of it like your own personal holding company, but set up offshore, specifically for holding financial assets. Super popular for, tax planning, consolidating different investments, even succession planning.
And where would you typically find these?
Common jurisdictions were places like the British Virgin Islands, the Bahamas, maybe the Cayman Islands. Standard choices, really.
Makes sense. And then offshore funds.
Right. Offshore funds, or FOs. These are more like collective investments. Think mutual funds, but based outside Brazil.
So pooling money from different investors.
Exactly. Mostly used for portfolio diversification, passive investing. You'd often see them set up in Ireland, Luxembourg. Again, the Caymans are popular there, too.
Okay. And the third one you mentioned was trusts.
Yes, trusts. Now, trusts are a bit different. It's a legal structure where you, the settlor, transfer control of assets to someone else, a trustee.
Okay, a third party.
Right. And the trustee manages those assets for the benefit of others, the beneficiaries. Trusts were heavily used for more sophisticated succession planning, asset protection, that sort of thing.
And jurisdictions for those?
Places like the Bahamas, Jersey, Guernsey, known for having well-established trust laws.
So, putting it all together, before 2024, these PICs, funds, trusts, they were fundamental, key for diversification, cross-border investing, inheritance, and crucially, that legal tax deferral.
That's the picture, yes.
But then, the game changed. So how exactly are these structures treated now? What's the core shift?
Right, this is the heart of it. That old system, the one built on deferral, paying tax only when the money came back, it's gone. Completely overhauled.
Wow.
The new regime, which kicked in for 2024, moves to an annual taxation model for many of these structures. It's not just a small adjustment. It fundamentally dismantles that decades-long strategy of tax deferral.
So no more indefinite reinvestment offshore without tax consequences back in Brazil.
Not for controlled entities, no. It really shakes the foundation of many existing offshore setups. People need to urgently reassess strategies they might have had for years.
Okay, so tell us about Law 14.754/2023. What does this annual taxation look like?
Well, it introduces what's essentially CFC-style regime.
Yeah.
CFC meaning Controlled Foreign Corporation.
Okay, I've heard that term.
Yeah, it's common in other countries. Basically, the Brazilian tax authorities now look at the profits earned by your controlled offshore company, and they treat them as if you, the individual shareholder in Brazil, earned them directly, and they tax them annually, even if not a cent comes back to Brazil.
Annually. Regardless of repatriation, that is a game changer.
Huge. It totally changes the cash flow planning, the whole mindset.
And what about trusts? You said they were used a lot.
Yes, and this is another major development. Trusts are now formally recognized for tax purposes in Brazil.
Even though Brazil itself doesn't have trust law.
Exactly. That's the fascinating part. They don't have a direct equivalent in their civil law system, but the tax law now explicitly addresses them. They're taxed transparently.
Transparently meaning?
Meaning the tax authorities essentially look through the trust. Depending on the structure and timing, either the settlor, the person who created it, or the beneficiaries will be liable for the tax.
Okay. And are there new rates?
Yes, specific rates apply now. If you take capital reductions out of these entities, it could be taxed at 15% up to 22.5%. Foreign dividends face rates from 0% up to 27.5%.
0%. How does that work?
Well, there are some specific exemptions or conditions, particularly around profits earned before the new law, but the top rate is 27.5%. And critically, don't forget ITCMD.
Ah, the inheritance and gift tax.
Correct. That might now apply to distributions coming out of trusts, too. It adds another layer you have to plan for.
This is getting complex. Can we clarify some key concepts? You mentioned transparency, control.
Good idea. Let's nail those down. Transparency, think of it as the tax authorities having X-ray vision. They look right through the offshore company or trust.
Right.
The income isn't just the entities anymore. It's attributed directly to the Brazilian owner or beneficiary. That layer of separation for tax deferral, it's largely gone for controlled entities.
Okay, and control.
Control is the trigger. If a Brazilian resident individual controls directly or indirectly more than 50% of a foreign entity,
50%.
more than 50, yes. Then that entity falls under this new annual CFC taxation regime. Its profits get taxed back in Brazil each year.
Got it. And you also mentioned something about disguised loans, ASC.
Yes, AFC Adiantamento para Futuro Aumento do Capital. It's this idea of disguised loans or capital. The Receita Federal now has more power to look at money you put into your PIC, for instance.
Yeah.
And they might say, hold on, this wasn't really an equity investment. This looks more like you lending money to your own company.
And why does that matter?
Because the tax treatment can be very different and often much worse than if it's treated as a proper capital contribution. It's something you definitely need to structure carefully now. And what's really quite striking here is how Brazil is handling trusts specifically.
Yeah, you mentioned they don't really have them in their own law, but they're taxing them now.
Exactly. It's a big conceptual leap. Foreign trusts are now formally recognized, but only really for tax purposes. There's still no direct equivalent in Brazilian civil law.
So how does the tax actually work for trusts under these new rules?
Generally, the settlor, the person who set up the trust, gets taxed annually on the trust's income.
Okay.
Unless, and this is important, unless the trust is irrevocable and the distribution of assets or income to the beneficiaries can be clearly proven.
Ah, so irrevocability and proof of distribution are key.
Very key. If those conditions aren't met, the settlor pays. If they are met, or when distributions happen, the beneficiaries then pay income tax that could be up to 27.5% on what they receive.
And possibly the ITCMD gift inheritance tax, too.
Possibly, yes, on top of the income tax. And there's even a specific ruling, COSIT ruling 75025, that confirms many common foreign trust structures are treated as fiscally transparent. It reinforces that look-through idea.
Okay, so given this new tax reality, how are people actually using trusts now? Are they still useful, especially for succession?
Yes, definitely still suitable, maybe even more critical for certain goals. For succession planning, they remain very powerful, especially if you pair a trust with something called a declaration of trust, or a DOT.
A DOT, what's it?
It's essentially a document linked to, say, an offshore company held within the trust that specifies exactly how shares should be distributed upon the settler's death, for example.
Ah, like pre-programmed instructions.
Precisely. And that allows for potentially automatic distribution of assets. It can bypass local probate processes in some places, which saves a huge amount of time, money, and hassle.
That makes sense. which brings us squarely to succession planning in this new world.
Hmm.
It seems more crucial than ever for families.
Absolutely critical. And the stakes are much higher now, depending on how you plan or if you plan.
So compare the scenarios for us. What happens if someone has international assets but, well, no planning, no will, no trust?
That's the nightmare scenario, frankly.
Yeah.
You're looking at needing probate, both in Brazil and in every foreign country where assets are held.
Multiple probates.
Yes, international probate. It can be incredibly time-consuming years, easily expensive, and it drags all those global assets into the Brazilian court system. Imagine a family just assuming things would pass smoothly, suddenly facing legal battles everywhere.
Ouch. Okay, what about just having a Brazilian will? A local will?
Better than nothing, for sure, but you still face parallel probate processes. One in Brazil for Brazilian assets, and separate ones abroad for foreign assets covered by the will.
So still complex, still involving multiple jurisdictions.
Yes. Faster than no will, certainly more orderly, but still complex and costly compared to other options.
Which leads us back to trusts, or these declarations of trust.
Right. The big advantage here, especially now, is those predefined instructions for beneficiaries. If it's structured correctly, it can often bypass probate entirely for the assets held within the structure. It offers much more legal clarity, speed, and efficiency.
Are there specific tools people are using?
We're seeing things like transfer on death agreements, TODs. You might see those linked to, say, custody accounts based in Miami. And these declarations of trust are often used with companies domiciled in places like the Bahamas. They provide a much clearer, smoother path for transferring wealth. But all this planning and structuring...
Well, it brings up a really important point, doesn't it? The compliance burden.
Ah, yes. The paperwork. It must have increased significantly.
Oh, dramatically. The
Yeah.
tax man isn't just knocking anymore. The requirements are much more specific and demanding.
So what filings are essential now for Brazilians with offshore assets?
Well, you've got your main annual income tax return, the DAA, Declaração de Ajuste Anual. That's where you have to meticulously report all your foreign income and assets now, every detail.
Okay.
And then there's the DCBE. That's the Declaration of Foreign Held Assets. If you hold assets outside Brazil worth over US $1 million, you have to file this annually.
$1 million US annually.
Correct. So comprehensive, detailed reporting isn't really optional anymore. It's mandatory.
And with more complexity, I imagine there are more ways to trip up. What are some common pitfalls people should really watch out for? Absolutely. We see a few recurring issues. One big one is misreporting trust structures. Now that Brazil taxes them specifically, you can't just, ignore them or call them something else on your return. That's asking for trouble.
Right. Needs proper classification.
Exactly. Another pitfall is undeclared income from those reinvested offshore profits. Remember, under the old system, you could defer. Now, if it's a controlled entity, those reinvested profits are taxed annually. Forgetting to declare that income is a serious compliance failure.
And the third.
Incorrect classification of capital contributions. That AFIC issue we discussed. If you put money into your PIC, you need solid documentation showing its genuine equity. Otherwise, the receipt of federal might just reclassify it as a loan.
With potentially much higher taxes.
Precisely. Proper documentation and structuring are key to defending your position.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together. For our listeners managing international wealth from Brazil, or advising those who do, what are the most critical, practical strategies for this new era?
Okay, 3 main areas. First, tax efficiency. PICs can still be useful, yes, for pooling assets, but they now really need to meet substance requirements.
Substance, meaning...
Real economic activity, not just a letterbox company. You might need an actual office, qualified staff, real decision-making happening in that offshore location to avoid being seen as purely tax-motivated, which could trigger harsher rules.
Okay, real activity. What else for efficiency?
For offshore funds, you need to be very careful about distinguishing income versus capital gains. The new rules treat them differently, so getting that classification right is crucial to avoid tax mismatches.
Got it. Second area.
Succession optimization. Definitely consider using tools like a declaration of trust or a formal trust deed. You can even build in conditional clauses.
Like what?
Like distributions only happen when a beneficiary reaches a certain age or finishes university, things like that. Gives the settlor more control over the timing. And critically, make sure the governing law clause in your trust documents is crystal clear. Which country's law applies. Ambiguity here can cause huge enforcement headaches later on.
Good point. And the third area?
Has to be compliance management. This isn't a set it and forget it situation anymore. You need regular reviews of your structures.
By whom?
By qualified cross-border tax counsel, people who understand both Brazilian law and the laws where your structures are based. And maintain robust documentation. Keep everything. Records supporting classifications, valuations, everything. You need to be ready to show your workings to the Receita Federal.
Wow. The scale of these changes in Brazil, it's really something. It feels like a complete rewrite of the rules for offshore wealth, moving away from deferral, pushing hard on annual tax and transparency.
It absolutely is. The entire playbook has changed.
It really underlines the need for accurate structuring, doesn't it? And that proactive reporting you mentioned.
Cannot emphasize that enough. Meticulous documentation, proactive reporting, strategic structuring. It demands a whole new level of diligence now.
You know, thinking about this big push for transparency in Brazil, it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, doesn't it? What does this signal for global wealth management generally?
It's a key question.
Are other countries watching Brazil? Could this be a kind of blueprint? Is this perhaps the beginning of the end for traditional offshore tax deferral strategies as we knew them worldwide? Something to definitely mull over.
It certainly is. And for those listening who want to keep digging deeper after this discussion, well, there's homework you can do.
Oh, yeah?
I'd highly recommend actually looking at sample trust deeds, sample PIC incorporation documents. See how they're put together. Get familiar with the detailed guidance coming out of the Receita Federal. Those COSIT rulings are important interpretations.
Yeah, read the primary sources.
Exactly. And most importantly, if this affects you, talk to the experts. Work closely with cross-border legal and tax professionals. Get your specific structures reviewed. The learning here really never stops, and understanding these details is absolutely key to navigating this new landscape successfully.